Welcome to the Living with Narcissists podcast, where the first recommendation is don't. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. So this is your haven for validation, insight, strategies, and resources. So let's get started. Welcome, I'm Carrie, and this is the Living with Narcissists podcast. Today's episode will focus on CPTSD, Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, also referred to as childhood PTSD. Published in 2014, Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, a self-help guide to recovering from the lingering effects of childhood trauma, offers insights as well as practical, effective tools for healing and recovery. While many people associate CPTSD with physical or sexual abuse, people can also develop CPTSD from verbal and emotional abuse, or even emotional neglect. When a child has experienced 4 or more ACEs, it's easy to conclude they have experienced complex trauma, which is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. Walker explains that CPTSD is a psychological condition that comes from prolonged, repeated abuse or neglect, usually in childhood. Being a child means you have no agency, so in general, you can't escape the traumatizing environment. Basically, you're a hostage. When we are in fear of danger, our brain's alert system triggers a response in an attempt to protect ourselves. This activates the sympathetic nervous system, which most people refer to as the fight or flight response. Walker created a model to detail the impact of adverse childhood experiences and how it leads to childhood PTSD. This results in 4 basic defense structures to develop: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The 4 F's, which is what I will refer to them from now on, are physiological responses that help people defend themselves against real or perceived threats. Fight is an aggressive response to danger. Flight means that you're fleeing danger or launching into hyperreactivity. Freeze is triggered when resistance is futile. So you give up, you numb out into dissociation, and you might even collapse, accepting the inevitability of being hurt. Fawn is a response to a threat by being pleasing or helpful to appease or forestall an attacker. The response of the 4 F's, the sympathetic nervous system, occurs when you are in stressful, traumatic, or dangerous situations, and it can help people sharpen their focus, increase reaction time, and prioritize bodily functions. However, if these responses become overactivated, they can have negative physical and mental health consequences. An overactive sympathetic nervous system leads to hyperarousal and hypervigilance, which is a symptom of CPTSD. When triggered, you may experience other symptoms: toxic shame, emotional flashbacks, self-abandonment, social anxiety, and a pervasive inner critic. Toxic shame is an overwhelming sense of being loathsome, ugly, stupid, or fatally flawed. The intense disdain reflects the suffering from parental traumatization due to their contempt, criticism, belittling, or cruelty. It can be created by parental neglect or rejection, and the parent's negative response to the child obliterates the child's self-esteem with feelings of worthlessness and contempt. When triggered, you may experience what Walker calls abandonment melange, which is an intense, overwhelming sense of shame, fear, and depression. Symptoms of abandonment trauma can include extreme insecurity or anxiety within a relationship, obsessive or intrusive thoughts of being abandoned, and also debilitating self-esteem or self-regard. Abandonment depression afflicts traumatized children, deadening their feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, and that inhibits them from seeking comfort and support. Reenactment of childhood abandonment occurs by isolating and surrendering to overwhelming humiliation. All of the other 4 symptoms are experienced with an overlay of toxic shame. Emotional flashbacks, which is a regressive state that can last for an instant, or it can be a prolonged regression that causes intense, overwhelming feeling states of childhood abuse and neglect. And that includes fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and maybe even depression. The dominant feeling of fear is anxiety, being panicky, and feeling suicidal. The dominant feeling of despair is profound numbness, paralysis, and desperation to hide. The intensity can vary from subtle to horrific. There's also self-abandonment, which is when you reject, suppress, or ignore part of yourself in real time. In other words, you have a need or desire you want to meet, and often you make the decision not to meet it. Social anxiety is an intense, persistent fear of being watched and judged by others. This fear can affect work, school, and other daily activities. It can even make it hard to make and keep friends. In addition to inborn temperament, the negative experiences of childhood, like teasing, bullying, rejection, ridicule, or humiliation, may increase the likelihood of a social anxiety disorder. And other negative events in life, such as familial conflict, trauma, or abuse, may also be associated with this disorder. And lastly, the vicious inner critic. A viciously critical inner voice is developed by internalizing the abuse or neglect. This book offers techniques to identify, challenge, and reduce the power of the inner critic. When I became aware that the inner critic wasn't really my voice, but the embedded voices of critical, dismissive, humiliating, and rejecting caretakers, it became easier to quiet the inner critic. Honestly, I would just say to myself, shut the bleep up. You are not me. You are somebody else. And the words that you're saying to me are completely untrue. It is your projection onto me. I'm not that person. You were that person. Recommendations for recovery include self-compassion and self-care. You need to recognize the importance of developing self-compassion in order to recover from childhood CPTSD. Walker encourages practices like mindfulness, self-soothing, and setting healthy boundaries. He also recognizes the need to grieve and mourn the unmet childhood needs and losses. It's a very important step toward recovery and self-acceptance. Here are some of the steps that you can take to grieve from the loss caused by abandonment. Write a letter to the object of your abandonment. Tell that person all of your feelings of sadness, anger, rejection, and confusion. Also, you can write a letter to your feelings of longing that you write to yourself. And you can give yourself the right to feel. Just let yourself feel and let those emotions come through you, release them through writing. And it is amazing how helpful writing these feelings down. Because sometimes when you're talking or trying to explain to the person who abandoned you or hurt you or rejected you or humiliated you, you try to explain to them how hurtful that was to you. And of course, they're not going to accept responsibility for what they did and will many times be in complete denial. So you never really feel a sense of closure. But when you write it down on a piece of paper, it's in hard copy, it's kind of like you're handing off those feelings, and now they can reside on the paper. They don't have to reside in you anymore. I highly recommend Walker's book, and some consider it to be the Bible of CPTSD recovery. When I read this book, it illuminated the trauma and neglect I experienced in childhood, and it made me aware of how it was affecting my thinking, especially when I was triggered. This book allowed me to observe my hyperreactivity and thought process, and how it was an extension of my childhood coping skills when I had no agency. But I am not a little girl anymore, and I can overcome my distorted thinking with awareness, and I can learn how to cope with life in a much healthier way. This book provides awareness and skills, and info will be in the show notes, of course. Thank you for joining me. I hope this information is helpful. If you like my content, please choose to follow, subscribe, or provide a rating so I can share this information with more people and you don't miss out on future episodes. I look forward to sharing more in the future. Have a wonderfully peaceful day. Till next time.